Thank you. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Karen Milstein-McKinnon from the Community Justice Center. I'm the managing director, and I'd like to invite one of our board members, Kaya Everson, up to start us off in a good way.
Gelakastla, nuga utma, gayutlanlach, comox glutzachis, glu Netherlands, olakalan mutla. Gelakastla, gikame, gelakastla, ninok sola, gelakastla, ninok ogd. Hello, everyone. My name is Kaya Everson. I go by she, her. My ancestry is Comox, Kwagyut, Dutch, and Norwegian. I am also a part of the 2S LGBTQIA community. I also sit on the board of directors for the Community Justice Center, who's hosted this event tonight. I'd like to remind everyone that we are gathered on the traditional unceded lands of the Pentlatch, Aixen, Satlut, and Sasitla, who've occupied these lands since time immemorial. That this has and will always be Indigenous lands, and we continue to thrive, live on, and protect it. We must reconcile with the truth that colonial peoples, many of our ancestors, have attempted to dismantle and annihilate Indigenous peoples via Canadian law, policy, and practice. A few examples of these atrocities were through enacting laws keeping Indigenous people on reserve, unable to vote, get legal representation, placing children in abusive institutions known as residential schools, making ceremony and their forms of government illegal, and stealing sacred lands and resources. Our ancestors and our next generations are watching us, and we need to do better through accountability, reparations, and allyship moving forward. I'd like to lift my hands to you for joining us this evening and having the courage to witness and be a part of this conversation, the challenging discussion of polarization. We may have differing views, come from differing races, classes, backgrounds, privileges, and upbringings. However, when opinions, judgments, and fear affect the existence and safety of our community members, that's when we need to take a good look at ourselves and our ways of thinking and shift our focus to protecting one another. Our world is changing, and people in power are doing great harm. I only hope and trust that we, Canadians, can move forward together and not let polarization affect our human rights and humanity. Gelakastla, thank you for listening and enjoy.
Thank you, Kaya. So, hello, everyone. I'm Karen Milstein-McKinnon, pronouns she, her, and I'm the managing director of the Community Justice Center. The center is a volunteer-powered nonprofit that uses restorative justice principles and practices to support peacemaking and the resolution of conflicts in the community. This is achieved through restorative justice resolution conferences, dialogue, and education. The seed for tonight's presentation was set almost a year ago when numerous community members reached out to the CJC asking us to bring education and dialogue to the community on the theme of polarization. As time went on, this ask was repeated, and it became clear that this was an unfortunate growing theme that was causing distress to individuals and within our community. Right before we started promoting the event, Webster Dictionary declared that polarization was the 2024 word of the year. Still, after that, I still had some bad dreams where nobody came other than two people. And I will say those two people are actually in the room, so thank you. However, the event sold out very, very swiftly, with people, I would say, clamoring for tickets. So I want to thank you all, as per Kaya's welcome. Thank you for being here. You know, the interest is an indication of the care people have for our community. And I know you've taken time away from busy lives to be here tonight, so I really appreciate it. I want to also thank NIC for their sponsorship, assistance, and incredible teamwork in putting this together. We're going to get started promptly with our program, but I just have a few more things to share and some requests. In the reminder email for this event and on the sheet that you got when you came in, there are some agreements that we've asked you to abide by. These are to keep you well and to keep each other well and to respect our time together, because we know topics like polarization can be difficult. As part of this agreement, we've asked you to take care of your own needs. We will not be taking a break during this event, so please feel free to get up, stand in the back, use the washroom. Do not be shy to do that. We want you to be comfortable and well. We do have wellness individuals in the room and de-escalation individuals in the room, should that be needed. Couple things to orient yourself to the room. The water and washrooms are out that door, and the emergency exit is right here. When we get to the question period, both myself and Thanu from NIC, who's been very helpful in organizing the event, will be holding the mics. We'll be on either side of the room. We will hold the mic for you. And we ask you to be mindful of staying on topic and respecting time when you put your question forward. We're also asking for questions. We have Terry and Roger here who are videoing, and I will probably take some still photos. If you have any concern about being captured, please just check in with me afterwards, and I'm sure we can accommodate any needs that you have. So I know there's tons of content to cover, so I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to invite Rumer, who's an NIC student and also a volunteer at the Community Justice Center, to introduce our facilitator and speaker this evening.
Hi, everyone. I am Rumer. Oh, there we go. Tonight we have Melanie Nagy, who is the Associated Director of Community and Public Affairs at North Island College and the Executive Director of the North Island College Foundation. In these roles, she leads a dynamic team dedicated to sharing the college's story and fostering community connections to better support students. With over 20 years of experience in journalism, Melanie previously served as the CTV National News Bureau Chief in Vancouver, covering major issues such as wildfires, the opioid crisis, and BC's affordability challenges. Her international reporting has taken her to crisis zones around the world, including the Horn of Africa during the 2018 famine. She's also reported on the global events such as the 2016 Brexit vote and the refugee crisis in Jordan. Her work has earned multiple awards and a 2018 Canadian Screen Award nomination. Born in Prince George, BC, Melanie holds a degree in English literature and political science from UBC and studied broadcast journalism at BCIT. Outside of work, she enjoys hiking, traveling, and spending time with her dog, Fisher. We are also joined with Jennie Barron, who is the project director of Courageous Dialogues Moving Beyond Polarization, a 3-year research project. She has served as chair of Mir Centre for Peace at Selkirk College since 2018 and has been an instructor of peace and conflict studies since 2007. She currently teaches courses on nonviolent methods of social change and restorative justice. Jennie holds a PhD in human geography from Carleton University, 2014, a master's of environmental studies from York University, 1998, and an honors bachelor of arts and sciences from McMaster University, 1993. She has also earned a certificate in restorative justice from SFU in 2015, and previously volunteered with Nelson Police Department's Restorative Justice Program. A proud mother of two young men, Jennie loves skiing, hiking, sailing, and embarking on long canoe trips. We are thrilled to have you here, and I'll hand it over to them.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And Jennie, thank you for being here with me today. It's so nice to have you here. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for coming out. I'm really happy to be in Courtenay. I don't often get the chance to come here all the way from Nelson, but I do love this corner of the province. And in fact, my grandmother grew up here. Fun fact. I don't know if it's enough to give me street cred, but it's a fact.
Okay, so polarization. Let's just dive right in. This, Jennie, is a timely topic. It's an important topic, but it's also a really big one. It's got many layers, many different approaches. And I just want to kind of set the stage with a foundational question. How do you define polarization?
Thank you so much for asking me that, because as an academic, I really believe it's important to define our terms. And Karen mentioned that the Merriam-Webster Dictionary chose polarization as the word of the year for 2024. And I think sometimes when that happens, a word is being used that much, it started to be overused in a way, and sort of we overgeneralize about it. So the first thing I want to say is that not all conflict is polarization. There are, in fact, healthy ways to have conflict, but how I define polarization is as a complex social dynamic that occurs when an issue involving many different people and opinions and concerns or facets is reduced to just two sides that are understood to be in opposition to each other, like opposite ends of a spectrum. And we usually remember the oppositionality part, but what's equally important is this reduction, this oversimplification into just two points of view. So it's a very binary way of thinking about issues. We tend to see the language of us versus them, and sometimes us versus the enemy. I'm right and you're an idiot, that kind of thing. And if it's not said, we feel it sometimes. There's this collapse of the middle. And by that, I mean the whole field of possibilities between the two poles. We see distorted information and information that's used not really to inform healthy debate, but to attack the other side. So people will tend to seek out information that supports their position, regardless of accuracy, and dismiss other information that's kind of inconvenient because it doesn't really fit the narrative. We see a rejection of other people who think differently. And so this is another place where there are some misunderstandings. It's not our differences per se that are the problem. It's how we relate to those differences, how we orient to them. We talk about affective polarization. Ideological polarization is ideas that are different or polar opposite. Affective is the way we come to feel animosity, bad feelings towards each other. And then we reject other people because they think differently from us. Sometimes we even see personal attacks. The idea that opponents don't just hold different opinions, but they're morally defective. And then finally, kind of counterintuitively, there's disengagement. And this, I think, comes about because the conflicts become so rancorous that people just don't want to have anything to do with them. So they just avoid the issues and avoid the people.
In that, so you just walked us through this fulsome definition of polarization, but this idea of division or conflict, it's not, a modern construct. There's been conflict and division throughout history. So I'm curious what your take is on what's driving polarization today.
That also is a very good question because there are a number of different drivers and they're not necessarily the ones that first come to mind. I will name the ones that you're probably thinking, but first I'll go right to what many researchers understand as root causes. And the root causes are inequality and perceptions of unfairness. real unfairness and sometimes perceived unfairness, as we know certain leaders are good at cultivating that idea, right? A second really important driver is profound changes that threaten us, whether those are technological changes from things like things that threaten our jobs. In my own job, could be AI any day now. Demographic changes, things like immigration, which many people experience as threatening, shifting cultural norms, and existential threats like COVID and climate change. The third really important kind of driver are the threats to our sense of our identity and our sense of belonging, our secure social standing, or our accustomed place in society. When we feel that changing or being challenged, we feel very insecure. So you've probably heard a lot of talk about, the slipping middle class. A lot of us are feeling more and more insecure economically. But it's also about challenges to our sense of ourselves as good people, right? That can be very threatening when we thought we were a good person and now we feel like we're being regarded as not a good person. Then you have articulated grievances, things that are really objectively, rotten things that people have a right to complain about. And that's like a match thrown on dry tinder, all those other drivers that I mentioned. And then you have conflict entrepreneurs who are the gasoline thrown on the fire.
Conflict entrepreneurs. I want to come back to that one because I think that's something that we're going to want to explore, and it might be a term that people aren't familiar with. But before we dive into conflict entrepreneurs, I bet you everyone here tonight can think about an issue or an event that's polarizing, something you've experienced that's been polarizing, and one that nearly probably impacted or affected nearly every Canadian is the pandemic, COVID-19, and the response to the pandemic. Jennie, it felt like that really escalated or almost turbocharged polarization. So kind of considering those drivers, and when you think about that event, talk to us a bit about polarization through that frame or that lens.
I think it was a case of the perfect storm of all of those drivers coming together. We had a truly existential threat, for some people more so than others, but collectively, that's what we were experiencing. We had social and economic losses. We had perceived unfairness. Now, some of us may have felt that the public health measures were fair and reasonable, and many other people felt like they were being discriminated against. And you can't argue with what people's perceptions are. Grievances. We all had a lot to complain about, right? We were getting pretty grumpy. And then we had conflict entrepreneurs who, instead of trying to help us with these things, some of them were seeing an opportunity, I think, to use COVID to advance other agendas. So, yeah, they were all there.
So conflict entrepreneurs. I want to kind of dive into that because when I think of polarization, I think of polarizing figures. And one that comes to mind right now, President Donald Trump. If anybody were to kind of embody that idea of us versus them, I kind of liken it to the president. But I'm just wondering, conflict entrepreneurs, are these people who thrive off division? Are they fueling polarization? Just kind of define and share for us what a conflict entrepreneur is.
Sure. It would be an individual or an organization that is either manufacturing or exacerbating conflict for some kind of gain. It could be fame, infamy, it could be power, it could be money, and it could be all three.
And so our conflict entrepreneurs, are you feeling that they're more plentiful and abundant? Like, so when you say it could be organizations, is that like, could that be like a meta or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So Meta, the parent company, of course, of Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and now Threads, as many of you, I'm sure, know, they have a business model that's basically based on generating outrage for profit. They know very well that fear and loathing are two of our strongest emotions, and they keep us engaged much longer than the happier emotions do. And what's useful about that for them is that the longer we stay engaged on the platforms, the more the more data they can harvest from us, which they can use then to sell targeted advertising that targets us. How many people are familiar with Noam Chomsky? Done any reading there? Oh, well, great. Okay, so you probably know that, decades ago, he was saying that with the move to sort of advertiser-supported media, and this was before social media, but, we became the product, right? Content providers were basically selling our eyeballs, selling our attention to advertisers, and that's exactly what Meta's doing. You might remember also the scandal around Cambridge Analytica. Does that ring a bell with some people? Yeah. So the scandal was that they used illicitly acquired Facebook data on millions of Americans and Brits, people that they then identified as influenceables, and they generated posts to put into their feeds that helped swing the vote in favor of Brexit and the 2016 American election. There's a film about that called The Great Hack, which I recommend. Maybe it sounds like maybe some people have seen that. I recommend it, but it is terrifying, partly because it's, I think, becoming more widespread. My organization, the Mir Centre for Peace, we hosted Carol Off last week, which was fantastic. And I was in your chair. I'm always in your chair, actually. You've never been in this chair. She was talking about her book, At a Loss for Words, Conversation in an Age of Rage. And in that book, she says there are something like 38 countries now where social media is being manipulated to influence elections. So that's one kind. And then we have troll farms, of course, a great example of that being the Internet Research Agency in Russia. Private company working in the service of Russian intelligence. They used social media to disseminate flagrantly false information, whether it was about Ebola outbreaks or chemical spills or assassinations that hadn't actually happened. And between 2013 and 2016 alone, they were responsible for something like 76 million Facebook posts, 183 million likes on Instagram, and 10 million tweets. The goal was to breed distrust of government and division within the US electorate. It worked, of course, because the ground was already fertile. Americans didn't need a whole lot of help with that. It's a very dangerous type of organization. It's important, though, to say that a lot of people working for that organization and others were not doing it because they were ideological supporters of Putin. They were often young people just looking to make a buck and, having no scruples, I guess, when it comes to using imaginative and made-up content to generate outrageous stories. And the more outrageous the clickbait, the more ad revenue they can generate. Carol Off has a great quote here. She says, "Controversy pays, and it turns out the best controversy is manufactured. Us against them is social media's most lucrative narrative."
Well, and we all see that, don't we? If you're on your social media platform, whether it's X or Facebook, Instagram, if something is controversial or just totally out there and it starts getting a lot of attention and shared, we see that all the time. And kind of in that frame of social media, Jennie, I'm just wondering, sometimes too, we tend to blame social media for polarization, saying social media is making us have this polarized world. I'm just wondering sometimes if we try to scapegoat that social media without taking accountability of our own actions in that space.
I think it's a both and kind of answer here, because it's a lot more than a scapegoat for the reasons that I've just mentioned. But I do think that there is something to, reflecting on how we might be contributing. Some research shows that sometimes anyway, we may choose the side we're on, whether it's a political party to vote for, or whether it's a side on a controversy, a social issue, and then sort of adopt the slate of beliefs that go with it, rather than starting with what we think and then saying, well, therefore I should vote that, right? We go with team blue, team red, whatever it may be, team green, team orange. And sometimes it's about signaling to other people who we think we are. And our need to belong can lead us to stay silent when we don't 100% agree And that, I think, is unfortunate. That's one of the ways we might be contributing.
In this polarized world, where things like the way you framed it, sometimes it is a us versus them, these kind of black and white almost characteristics of these narrow views. I'm just wondering where pluralism fits in, or this idea of a diversity of voices and perspective. Just where does pluralism fit in when it comes to polarization?
Right. Okay. So I'll define a term again because I like that. So pluralism basically is this, coexistence of multiple viewpoints, or could be, cultural traditions or faiths or groups of people in a diverse society. And political pluralism, basically the belief that we will come to the best decisions when we have more voices at the table, more diverse political perspectives. That's not to say it's easy, right? It's messy, it's very hard, and sometimes there's compromise required, but the alternative really is, domination by one group or the other. And as much as we may believe that our side is right, every side, if you will, in a conflict, particularly in a polarized debate, has blind spots, has gaps, right? And so yes, I think we need pluralism, more than ever. And like I said, we're seeing this, this collapse of the middle, so we're losing it.
In this, some people sometimes look at polarization and say that if you were to give all voices equal access to platforms, that would put a dent in polarization. But I'm just wondering how we would navigate, or how we navigate best, this line between open expression and the potential harms that come with certain speech.
Yeah, really good question. So first of all, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying all, when I say we need pluralism, I'm not saying all viewpoints on any subject are equally valid or equally true. That's clearly not the case. There are some things that are patently incorrect, and there are things that we know are essential to a healthy, functioning democracy, or to the type of civil society that we want to live in, to the values that we hold, like whether those are, fairness or equality or human rights. And so I don't want us to slip into sort of a radical relativism. But when it comes to this idea of expressive harms or speech that we might want to somehow constrain, I think this is a really tough one, because there's a spectrum of types of speech that might be labeled harmful. And I think two very different things are going on simultaneously at either end of that spectrum. So on the one hand, we have some really vile things being said these days that would not have been remotely acceptable, just a few years ago. And, extreme racism, for one thing. We have laws for hate speech to define these, outer limits, and to say free speech, yes, but not unlimited. And I do think those are important, because overt bigotry has marked the beginning of some of the most dangerous movements in history. At the same time, hate speech laws are sometimes being weaponized now to silence dissent. I'll give you an example, and this might be one of these places where we don't all agree in this room, but that's the point. It's okay. There are activists who are calling for freedom for Palestinians right now, who are being threatened, suspended, fired, smeared, and their calls to end things like genocide or apartheid or illegal occupation. These are things that we can discuss, and we could, some might debate the definitions of those terms, but we cannot afford to have those calls conflated with hate. They're not the same thing. So that's on the one hand, the one end of that spectrum. And on the other hand, I think there has been a bit of an enlargement of the scope of what some consider harmful speech. It's sort of the illiberalism of the left, if you will. Things that we find offensive or triggering, there's more and more of a call to shut these down, and to say, these are dangerous. But I think it's very it's a bit problematic when we characterize either disagreement as hate or even really, offensive things as hate. And I guess the question is, it's both how is it harmful and where will it lead? And, you can't always say for sure, but also what will be effective to stop it. Shutting it down can backfire. That's my concern, is that sometimes when we shut down things that we don't want to hear other people say, it drives them underground. It can make them stronger. One example is, Twitter attempted a massive deplatforming of people who were involved in the January 6th attempted insurrection in the United States. And what actually happened in the end, unfortunately, is a lot of those people just migrated to a more extreme far-right platform called Gab, where their hate speech just intensified, and there was less sort of even attempt at regulation there, and it didn't have any discernible effect on reducing hate speech on Twitter. That's very disappointing, obviously, to hear, but I think it drives home this point. When we try to silence something, it may backfire and have the opposite effect. And I tend to think, or I wonder anyway, if with a lot of the views that we just really, really don't like, but that might not quite meet the test of hate speech or might not actually be dangerous, whether airing these views could, and then or allowing people to air them, and then other people, commenting on them and saying, hey, that's really, really unacceptable, and here's why, whether that might lead them to die a better death in the court of public opinion.
It's a tough one to navigate, though.
Yep.
It's even that idea of just your own level of comfort and discomfort, and that's a tough one. But
yeah, actually, can I add to that? The other thing about shutting down speech that we don't like, just really distasteful opinions, is that it can end up shutting down the people who have, legitimate concerns, or at least sincere, coming from a good place, but maybe they just don't know all the things that they might know about an issue. And it might shut down those concerns because those people are afraid to be seen as haters. But not everybody who raises a concern or asks a question is a hater, right? And so I think in a polarized climate, people feel pressure to take sides or shut up. And that the cost of that is a loss of some, potentially good ideas, or of having the benefit of being able to dialogue about things and, help people understand. And they won't get those answers if they can't ask the questions.
Right. Before everybody gathered here tonight, we asked people to share answers to the question, what is the opposite of polarization? And I believe Karen in the handout shared, there's like a word, some of the comments were shared in your handout. So people were thinking about that. And Jennie, I want to turn that question to you then. Yeah. You've defined polarization. Talk to us about the drivers, certain characteristics and players like conflict entrepreneurs. But from your vantage point, what is the opposite of polarization?
Okay, great. I suggested the question because I think it's really, really important for us to have a beacon, some sort of guiding light. What is it we're trying to move towards? If we're trying to, not just what we're trying to move away from. So thank you, everyone who responded to that question with your ideas. It was really great to see that word cloud. I'd like to start by first saying a few things about what I think it is not. And then I promise I will say what I think it is. And again, just my ideas, and not saying you're wrong. I think when we talk about moving beyond polarization, we're not talking about an absence of divergent views. We're not talking about an absence of conflict even. Conflict can be normal. Well, it is normal, and it's natural, and it's inevitable. Even if we tried to get rid of it, we wouldn't, right? And in fact, if you think of the most recent movie or story or something, book that you read, if it had no conflict, how interesting would it be? Okay, maybe not. Conflict can even be constructive. There are healthy ways for us to have conflict. It's also not neutrality. I think we should never be neutral on things like grave violations of human rights. We also do need to know what we mean by rights and by freedoms. Sometimes my students are a little surprised to learn there's no such thing as a right to party. Not been codified anywhere that I know of legally. And we also need to understand that individual freedoms have limits. So I remember in my undergrad in the Arts and Sciences program at McMaster University, we learned in a philosophy course, we learned, that the idea that in sort of classical philosophical liberalism, like that my freedom, to swing my fist with the big club of a cast it's got on here, ends at the tip of your nose, because at that point my freedom encroaches on your freedom. So individual freedoms are not unlimited. So that was just to say that we need to understand what rights and freedoms really are, and we need to defend them, and we shouldn't be neutral about those things. Going beyond polarization is also not about avoidance of topics that are controversial. Just about all the issues that we polarize around are things that are actually the things that we most need to discuss. They're really important, although we're starting to polarize around some less important things these days, just because I think it's almost become a bit of a a template now, unfortunately. So it's not avoidance. It's also not always agreeing to disagree. There may be times when we agree to disagree, but I think it's really important in a democracy to still say it's okay to try to persuade each other. I'm reading a book right now by Anand Giridharadas. Has anyone heard of him? A book called The Persuaders. And he says that persuasion is the lifeblood of democracy, and that when we give up on trying to persuade others, that we're actually showing contempt for them. We're saying, oh, these people it's hopeless, or they'll never change their minds, or they're not worth my time, and to talk to them. And he says we make a few mistakes here. One is we forget just how many of the really, really important things that have changed over the last few hundred years, whatever, that have made many of our lives better, have come about because of persuasion. And we also make the mistake of thinking that other people who think differently, that their views are really, really deeply rooted and very fixed, and there's no hope of changing them. And for a lot of people, they're not. Those views might be sort of what they picked up from somebody else they know. It might be an idea they haven't thought about that much, and maybe they're not all that attached to it. And as long as we don't attack them and drive them into a corner, they might be willing to consider new information and modify their thoughts. But we have to be able to persuade, and of course that means it's a two-way street. Open ourselves to being persuaded by other people too, having some intellectual humility to be able to say, actually there are limits to my knowledge, and actually I've been wrong before, could happen again. And actually maybe other people sometimes, do know a thing or two that I could learn from. There's a phrase that I really like, and unfortunately I can't remember who to give credit to for this one, but it's strong opinions loosely held. So you don't have to give up your strong opinion. You just need to be open to hearing other people's and asking why, and being able to explain yours. And I think, if we remember it's okay to persuade, then, advocacy is good. I'm not saying no advocacy. Activism is not a dirty word. I think it's really, really important, especially right now. There are some really, really important values that I think we share in this country that we are going to need to advocate pretty hard for. I'm actually more concerned about apathy and disengagement. I think it cedes the field to the poles, if you will, and it perpetuates this binary way of thinking about issues. So we need more engagement and more persuasion and more willingness to be persuaded.
So on that, diving into that, more engagement, more persuasion, we're kind of turning a corner here to talk about maybe potential tools we could use when navigating a polarized world.
But I didn't give you the,
You didn't, you didn't, you didn't. So what
So-
okay, so backing up,
Yeah.
what exactly then, how do you,
yeah,
we know our audience members have shared
Yeah.
how they view the opposite of polarization.
yeah.
Quick focus line, how do you define, or how
Yeah,
do you,
okay.
what's the opposite of polarization
Okay.
for you?
Well, I don't have a single word for it. So apologies if that seemed like a trick question. It wasn't meant to be a trick question at all. I'm going to give you a few different words that I think sort of characterize it. And the first one is civility. And I know that there's a critique of civility. I understand the critique. So I don't mean civility as in that kind of niceness that just sort of persists or allows, structural inequity and injustice to persist. I don't mean that. I just mean an end to the sort of rank rudeness and nastiness and, hostility that we see a lot of right now. We can advocate strongly for something without attack, without insult, right? Martin Luther King was regarded as being very militant in his views for peace, and against poverty, against war, for racial justice. But he did it with nonviolence and love. So the second thing, so that's what I mean by civility. But the second thing is remembering and respecting the humanity of those who think differently and appealing to it. Because people will never change their minds by being shamed, right? Or being disrespected. There's this concept we have in the field of peace studies called the two hands of nonviolence. And it comes from a Hindu concept called Ardhanavishvara. It was popularized by an American peace activist named Barbara Deming. And she basically asks us to imagine our two hands. And with one hand facing out, we're saying, stop, no, I won't abide by those words and those actions. They hurt me or they hurt people. I care about them. It's not right. With the other hand, we are saying, I am still open to you as a human being. I still respect that your humanity, and I will accord you dignity, and I will treat you well, and in the hopes that you will see why I'm saying no, with this hand. So those are the two hands of nonviolence. A third thing, characteristics, is I'm going to use a kind of old-fashioned word here, grace. Grace instead of condemnation. We need patience and compassion for people who are struggling with change or who are trying on new ideas. We all need that. We need room to grow. We need room to make mistakes. We need room to be wrong. And we need grace from other people so we can admit it. Polarized climates are just so unforgiving. Have you noticed? Yeah. So I think those of us who are in movements for change, we do really need to ask ourselves, do we want to keep policing the boundaries of these movements to keep people out if they're not in perfect alignment or they don't yet know the latest linguistic conventions, right? Or do we want to grow the movements? Because we can't do it by criticizing people. There's a woman an academic whose work I really like. Her name is Loretta J. Ross, and she talks about imagining our people that we share opinions with and that we don't share opinions with. And she says, imagine, you've got your 90% people with whom you overlap in how you think, 90%. And she said, our mistake is we fight about the remaining 10%. And we forget about the 90% of overlap. That's a big waste of our energy, and it doesn't grow a movement. And then we've got our 75% people. Now, those are people you want to give your best attention to and listen to and have dialogues with. And even the 50% people, there's probably good reason to try to do that if you're up to it. Not the 10% people, right? Don't make the mistake of thinking that overcoming polarization is about trying to convert the person who's most polar opposite to you, right?
And so these concepts that you're sharing are resonating, but sometimes it's hard to put those concepts into practice. Sometimes easier said than done. if you think of like a polarized world, sometimes it can be overwhelming, anxiety inducing, isolating. It can just feel also ever present and suffocating sometimes in this polarizing world. So I want to kind of get into these tangible tools people could use in that big picture, though. When you're navigating a polarized environment, you know, how can we better manage that or navigate that? Give me the tips.
I will. I promise. It's just one more thing I want to say. I know your job is to hurry me along, and my job is to be difficult. Yeah, you're trying so hard. I'm going to just say one more thing. A surprising source, Esther Perel, she says the opposite of polarization is paradox. And that's a really interesting thing. And I would tend to agree. And I mentioned the both and way of looking at things earlier. That's instead of an either or way of looking at things. And that's just this idea that sometimes things that are commonly held in opposition can both be true. And it is just really, really hard, but also necessary for us to try to acknowledge them both. So for instance, we might acknowledge that vaccines save, science shows vaccines save many, 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 many lives. And at the same time, some people tragically are injured by them. And so instead of lining up either behind vaccines will save us all or vaccines will hurt us all, we can try to hold that tension, and it can't sometimes be easily resolved. Another one might be, we might hold that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism, but then at the same time say, but real anti-Semitism is on the rise, and that really concerns me, right? Again, both and then we're finding a way through these polar opposite camps. So okay, so how can we manage?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, there's the big world of polarization, and you've kind of given us some framework on how we can maybe tackle that. But how many people here, you're with your friends, with your family, sometimes at the table, you're having a conversation. It could be current affairs, and it gets heated and uncomfortable in your personal, intimate spaces. And I think it'd be really valuable, particularly since we want to move beyond polarization in our personal spaces. How can we better navigate that, or what are some tools we can use, Jennie?
Okay. Well, there's a TED Talk by a woman named, I forget her name. I'm sorry. She says, take the other to lunch. Right? And that's, this idea that we should try to cultivate relationships across the divides and get to know real people, not just caricatures of them. Because when we don't know people who think something very different from us, and they're not in our immediate circles, we tend to imagine and fill in the blanks. And we tend to assume that they are the most extreme example of that opposite viewpoint. And what a lot of research shows actually is that there's this phenomenon of false polarization, or falsely perceived polarization, and that sometimes when we get talking, we find out that other people, they might have different priorities, different values, somewhat different values, but we might not be as far apart as we first think. So that's one thing that we can do. Not easy. None of this is easy. With the people that we do know, when we want to have a bridging conversation, the first thing we need to do is try to set up optimal conditions for it, at least assess the conditions that are there. So here's a tool. It's called the Conversation Dial, and it comes from an author named Monica Guzman, who wrote a book called I Never Thought of It That Way, How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times. And I give you the whole long subtitle there because I borrowed a little piece of it for this talk tonight. She says, imagine a console, and it's got 5 dials on it. And each of those dials represents a quality that if we have it in abundance, it's going to increase the chances of us having a successful bridging conversation. And those dials are time. Are we prepared to give this the time it's going to really take? Do we both have time at the same time? Attention. Are we really fully paying attention to what the other person's saying? We're not multitasking. We're not doing it on the fly. We're not doing it when we're distracted. Parity. And that means, is there a level playing field? Or does it feel like there's a great power imbalance? It's going to work better if it feels like a level playing field. So you're not on a level playing field, by the way, if you are commenting on somebody else's Facebook page and they've got 1,000 friends who are going to jump down your throat. Containment. is this a conversation that is contained? Do we know who's part of the conversation and that's where it ends? Or is it unlimited? On social media, it might be, it's unknown who the audience is or how big, who's listening, where these things are going to get shared. It's not contained. And embodiment. The closer we are to being in person, the better. So social media, no embodiment. Phone call, we've got the voice. Video call, we've got visual of another person and the voice. And then if we can actually be in the same room, it's the most embodied, and that's likely to help. So those are the five dials on the console.
And listening, is it play a role
Absolutely.
in that?
Yeah.
So not on the console, somewhere else,
No,
maybe?
no. So we need to practice authentic listening.
Right.
And that's not the pseudo listening that we sometimes engage in, where we're really just kind of waiting to make our points. It's listening where we're setting aside wanting to make our own points, and we are just trying to understand the other person. So some people have probably heard the term reflective listening. There's another term for it popularized by a guy named Gary Friedman, is looping. And it's really quite simple. First, you ask an authentically curious question, and then you listen to what the person is saying and try to go beneath the words. What is really important to that person? And you want to summarize it and reflect it back, but not just by paraphrasing, saying the same words. Again, you're looking for the subtext. You're saying, so am I hearing you? I'm kind of getting the sense that you think this. Is that right? So you check for understanding and you say, did I get that right? And if not, like, what am I missing? And you allow the person to correct you and add information until they feel they've been understood, by you. And your goal, of course, is to understand not just their position, which is what they believe or what they think needs to happen, but their underlying interests and their needs.
I'm just curious on the looping, though. Sometimes if you're trying to, in an earnest way, to kind of go, like you said, go below the layers and try to parrot that back or share that back, does that person also have to be aware of the looping, because they might see it as you maybe being condescending or just trying to mimic them? Like, is there?
Yeah, no, I think if you just paraphrase them back, people can get frustrated. I mean, I've heard that before when I've said something, to a colleague, and then I say, I'm feeling really frustrated, and he says, sounds like you're feeling really frustrated. Oh, yeah, I'm even more frustrated. No, I think I think the key is, getting beneath those things. And I mentioned asking authentically curious questions. So can I give a few examples of some of those kinds of questions? So, instead of saying, why do you think that? Which we all experience why as a challenging word, right? So we can say things like, can you tell me a story about when you started to feel this way? Or how you came to this position on this issue? What matters the most to you about it? What are you afraid I will get wrong? Or what would you most like me to understand? Is there anything you find frustrating about how you're seen with, in this point of view? You might even ask, is there anything that you think might be more complex than it's sometimes made out to be? And if you have trust with that person, you might be able to ask, are there any places where you feel any doubt or any possible disagreement with what other, people who are kind of saying these similar things are? And you might ask, where do you think or you hope we might find common ground?
What is so we've got our console, our dials.
Yep.
We've got our looping and our active, meaningful listening. Anything else that might help us when we're there and feeling charged?
Yeah.
We love the person in front of us, but it's going sideways. Anything else we can dive into?
Well, the third tool I have for you is called going to the balcony.
Okay.
This is a way to practice emotional self-regulation. Very, very hard. This idea of going to the balcony comes from William Ury, who was the founder of the Harvard negotiation project or program on negotiation. He was also one of the authors of the book Getting to Yes. which anybody heard of that one? Yeah, it sold something like 13 million copies. He wrote it with a friend. He was 28 years old at the time. Amazing. So he says, imagine yourself on a stage. You are negotiating, or you're, because he does negotiation, or you're in a debate or an argument with somebody. And then imagine a balcony and go there and look down on yourself, almost like you're having an out-of-body experience. This balcony is the place of perspective. It's a place of calm, and it's a place where you can remind yourself of your highest goal. What is it you really, really want to keep in mind? And so you don't get, pulled off that track, really. Is the goal really to win an argument? That might feel gratifying in the moment, but what will the lasting effects of that be? What purpose will that serve in the end? And ask yourself just, what would be the best possible outcome? And then with that, you might be able to sort of guide yourself to conduct yourself the way you'll be proud of later. And I want to say that this is incredibly hard stuff to do. Everybody needs to practice. Activists who were part of the civil rights movement in the US, they practiced for things like the lunch counter sit-ins that they did. They knew that they were going to face insults and verbal attacks and people pushing and shoving them and using racial slurs against them and maybe even pouring hot coffee on them. They practiced by role playing and hearing those things and practicing not getting triggered. Mm-hmm. So if you try this, first of all, don't expect to succeed right away. Expect to fail, or expect a little bit of failure, maybe some partial success. Sometimes I've said to myself, "Whew, I made it to 30 seconds without getting triggered. Maybe I can make it to 60 seconds next time." And just forgive yourself and don't stop trying.
I feel like that would be a perfect opportunity right now, Jennie, to open our floor and expand our conversation to invite all of you to participate if you'd like to, whether you want to share a question. And we've got our friends Karen and Thanu here. And it's okay if you don't have a question, because I can keep talking and ask Jennie questions.
Keep talking.
But anyone have a question or anything you want to share about, or question about what you've heard so far, whether it's the tools, definitions of polarization?
Oh yeah, right. I appreciate the part about conversation and having conversations with others. I actually really enjoy having these challenging conversations with someone who doesn't see the world the same way I do. But the hardest part about it for me is when they don't really, like, the rules for conversation are not really set. So like you were saying, how sometimes they're just waiting for their turn to speak, or or they'll go on and on and on, and then you say something that reminds them of a point and they jump in. Like, how do you promote like a fair level playing field for conversation?
I think it's possible to be explicit about our intentions and to say something like, "I'd really like to have a conversation with you about this, and I think it's going to be hard. At least it might be hard for me. And could we talk about how we'd like that conversation to go? And what are some ways, some guardrails we could put on it, or some guidelines or things that we could both agree to?" Because for it to really be a successful bridging conversation, both people have to show up in good faith, for starters, and they have to, like you said, you have to have that sort of parity or that understanding of what each other would like, and you can even say, what would make this a really, a satisfying conversation for you, and then that is your opening to say, "I think what would make it a really satisfying conversation for me is if we could do blah, 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 or not do blah, blah, blah." Is that okay? Yeah.
It's a good idea.
Hi there. I understand one of the better ways to do it is also to find some common ground that is not conflict ridden.
Mhm.
I teach a writing class at Elder College, and I have a student who's been who spent a whole career doing conflict resolution. And he said the first one he ever did was 4 nations in Africa that were basically fighting with each other forever. And he said, I had to start this off. And he said, I didn't have a clue. And I finally looked around the room and I said, tell me how you get married. And he said a half an hour schedule turned into 4 hours. And it just broke the ice in the whole thing. So
So
Absolutely.
finding that common ground.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's very wise to suggest it, we look for common ground on the things that aren't contentious first. And well, there's a practice that and of course I used to teach, I no longer teach, that it was on environment, conflict, and justice. And the practice of environmental peace building, and that involves bringing together people who are from maybe from different countries or communities that are in conflict with each other. And rather than talking about the things that they're actually in conflict about, they talk about their shared concerns about the environment. So Friends of the Earth Middle East did this with young people in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories and Jordan. And they brought them together to talk about water and their shared dependence on their shared waterways and their concerns about pollution and all the things that they could do about them. And so environmental peace building is using environmental issues that we can have common ground on in order to build relationships, peaceful relationships amongst people who maybe didn't even know each other before. And from there, you may have better chances of achieving, peace in the other areas that are the thornier subjects of contention, I guess. Oh, another really good one though for common ground is food.
Food, yeah.
Food. Great social lubricant and great way to, help people get to know each other. But
Gail Kesla, New Guam, Sarah, thank you so much for being here tonight. I got really curious if you could share a bit more around the differentiators between persuasion and manipulation. And I heard you talk about grace and patience and curiosity. And I'm thinking more about the global tools that are available to persuade. And when does that become manipulation? We talked about Cambridge Analytics and the Russia conglomerate that helped to shift things. So I'm hoping you can share some insight into when does persuasion become manipulation and what are some of those differentiators that we can watch for?
yeah. I think persuasion, well, thank you for the question. I don't know if I've ever thought about that before, so I'm going to think on my feet here. I think persuasion it's honest, right? It's open about what it's trying to do or what we are trying to do when we're trying to persuade. We're giving reasons. We're telling our stories. We are outlining a case for something, whereas manipulation is covert. And there, I don't know if there are places where they would overlap, but that's the biggest difference I would see between them.
I'm just wondering, Jenny, with that idea of manipulation and this idea of common ground, I was thinking then, even in these spaces, like that, what about like part of the foundation is sometimes misinformation? You could be trying to find your common ground, like, and we see so much of that. Like, how do we navigate or from that persuasion? What if it's loaded with misinformation? How does that play into it?
It's really, really hard. There's misinformation, which is, erroneous information where, we're humans, we make mistakes and it's sort of like broken telephone. Things get passed on and they lose some accuracy. Then there's disinformation, which is intentionally deceptive and intentionally false information being put out there. And there's a lot of that, right now, and it can seem to put an impasse, between us and those that we have, what we believe to be true, and somebody else believes equally fervently in, what, their, facts are. And I think we really need to make a distinction between those who put that disinformation out there and really do not have pure motives, and those who have fallen for it, or those who they believe in it, and maybe there's fear driving that, maybe there's insecurity, and again, I think if we remember the two hands of nonviolence, being able to say, I don't accept that fact, and this is why, or I disagree on this, but remaining open to the person, so we're not attacking them. The more we attack, the more people will really dig in with their my facts. Disinformation it's a really, really big challenge for all of us these days, and there are times when I think we need to look at what our limits and our capacities are. We always have a choice about whether to engage in a bridging conversation and a dialogue. And we have a choice not just to begin, but whether we do it, with whom, when, under what conditions, but also when we need to leave that conversation, and when it's proving to be just completely pointless, we exit. Right.
Thank you for sharing the tips that you were talking about in terms of the interpersonal communication that can help us move beyond polarization. I had a question, maybe more at like an institutional, organizational, governmental level, where we've seen the erosion of civility, which is really an erosion of respect for one another in institutions where we potentially thought it was enshrined, like in our own government, let alone others. And where do you see, how is it possible to influence that, or which organizations or bodies could potentially influence that? And do you have hope for improvement?
In the public sphere, like in government, are you meaning like in the House of Commons? For example, right?
Just
okay.
as one.
Well, just the other day, I read that debates there used to be so much more civil than they later became as soon as they became televised. So I kind of wonder, should we go back and bring in some containment, to that dialogue? But I think also we need to send the message that we really, really don't support those politicians who are just mudslinging and attacking others, that we don't respect that disrespect. And when there are politicians these days, and I believe there still are some, who do try to build bridges and try to act with decency, I think we need to elevate them. We need to shower praise on them. We need to thank them, and we need to instead of, some people will call them, disloyal if they cross the aisle, if they try to navigate some kind of, find some common ground or navigate some kind of compromise, right? And people will say, oh, you turn coat, you're disloyal, whatever. I think there's a very different way to see that, and see them as bridge builders. And so, all of us are, I don't know about all of us, maybe we have a tendency collectively to criticize and to focus more on the negative and less on giving praise where it's due. And I think, we need to shower our praise on those who are still behaving in a decent way.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk and the points. And I just wanted to pick up on, I think that point that you made about, you called it paradox, or the idea of it's possible for more than one thing to be true at the same time.
Yeah.
This is something I've been thinking about a lot, because I just see people around me, and I see that broader culture just kind of overwhelmingly losing that ability to hold that perspective. And I've found in conversations that I've had about controversial topics, when I'm sort of like, it makes it so hard to say something that is outside of a certain box of acceptable beliefs. I say one thing that I want to pick up on and go, I think this is something concerning that we should like discuss. And I'm shut down immediately, because it's like, oh, well, I guess you want to like, the Nazis to march across
you know, like, and so it's extremely isolating to, like, I come from that position naturally for some reason, but it feels like I'm in a small minority now. And I wonder what you think about, like, are there ways like in conversation with other people to kind of bring forward that idea, like about, hey, maybe like maybe both of these things can be true, or like just sort of cultivating that kind of ability to hold a agnostic position, and like, so with other people, and then also like, how can we uplift that as a society?
Great question. Thank you. Well, there's a difference between a both and way of looking at something, which is like both things can be true at the same time, and both sidesism, right? Which I think people, you know, for good reason, you know, react badly to if that's what they think you're saying. Are you saying they're equally at fault, or they're equally hurting, or they're equally wrong or equally right or something? And that's both sidesism, but I don't like that very much myself. Both and, you know, it might help. I don't know. It sounds like you've got some skill already in this area, but you know, to sort of gently introduce the idea. And you know, I think we need to practice by dissenting with our friends first, you know, because if we have strong enough relationships that we think they can withstand a little bit of disagreement, then we can say, hey, I like, you know, I mostly, you know, I think we're really in alignment on this. And can I just say, like, there's a little thing I have a bit of a doubt about, or I'm curious about this, or one thing I'm struggling with. And don't tell anybody else, but you know, admit a bit of doubt, a bit of uncertainty, and sometimes that can make it easier for other people to do the same. And the both and thing, I think, you know, call it that. Just say, you know, I'm not saying, you know, that I want whatever Nazis to start walking in and all over us. But what, you know, what I'm trying to say is this, and then see if they've understood you, and just say, or can I try out an idea on you, that, and just hear me out, if you will. Yeah, try it with trusted relationships first. And again, try to optimize the conditions on that, you know, on the console, the conversation dial, because where you're doing it, with whom, and under what conditions can really influence how well that goes for you.
I have a question or a curiosity about this on a community scale, thinking about community scale, and about the question of where. And where it is as a community that we practice these things. So we know how to do this, and we're learning, okay, individually, how to do this in relationship or in these more direct, but we've been so hungry for third spaces that I think social media has created a third space where you can have exposure and engagement with different points of view, but we know all of the problems. And I say this of several moderators here who are involved in moderating social media in this room, I think, are here. And it's because we have this deep commitment to creating third space for community dialogue. That's what's motivated many of us to take on these roles. So without that, in the current context, and given that we usually choose to spend our time with people that we have like values with, so we hobby with people and we hang out and join political parties, where's that third space? And do you have ideas or suggestions at a community scale of where we create the space for this work that moves it beyond individual relationship?
That's a good question. Thank you for the question. This is something that we're working on in our research project right now. I'm madly scrambling to meet a deadline next week for a big grant. And so if we get the money, you know, one of the things we're going to be doing is hosting dialogues across difference in public spaces. And we've looked at libraries, public libraries, as possible sites for this. But, you know, first of all, I'll say the reason why, and that's because of what they represent. First of all, they're part of the commons, you know, they, you know, belong to all of us. And they are places that have always defended intellectual freedom. I know a little librarian with a shirt that says, "We have something to offend everybody." And I think they're struggling right now with that. There's so many calls for censorship at libraries and, from both the right and the left. And they find themselves in very uncomfortable positions sometimes defending freedom of speech. And it's within the librarian community, they're divided too about where the line is, between freedom of speech and disinformation. And anyway, so that's why we're looking at libraries as a possible space, but there are other spaces too. But I don't think they should be one-offs where you just invite people, hey, anyone who's got a strong opinion about a really contentious subject, come, we'll sit in a circle here and it'll all go really well, I promise. I think it takes a lot of advanced preparation. So what we're looking at doing is identifying people who want to participate in them and doing some of the same type of preparatory work that we do in restorative justice in advance to bringing people together for a conference, and then laying the groundwork and the expectations, finding out, getting a little bit from them about what they're likely to say, and then and maybe even having some sort of preliminary meeting with food, where people can humanize each other and find some common ground that's maybe not on that contentious issue. And I don't think I'm necessarily naive, but I tend to be optimistic, just that with a lot of preparation and careful planning, that because the conditions, if the conditions are right, and these are embodied conversations amongst well-prepared people, screened too, as we do in restorative justice, that I think they can go well. And if you're interested in being part of our research, if we get the funding, yeah, get in touch with me.
My question's about the expertise, because sometimes these subjects are so huge, immigration, climate catastrophe, even the Middle East, that we can't all have conversations with a works cited list necessarily that we can bring up and defend our points of view.
Yeah.
So there is so much disinformation out there, even including in mainstream media, that doesn't allow necessarily for the complexity that is needed in conversations. So how do we handle that? That lack of expertise within conversations that we all start with? I guess where I tend to personally draw the line is if it dehumanizes anyone, then I'm out. I mean, in terms of that's my endpoint, but I think you know where I'm going with this one.
Okay, so expertise. I think we need to have some healthy skepticism when anybody presents themselves as an expert, but at the same time, not throw out the idea of expertise. We rely on expertise for our survival. But when people start talking and suggesting, they have some expertise, I think there are gentle, friendly ways to ask them, where did you read that? Or can you tell me where that came from? Or I'd be interested in reading a bit more about that. Or what are your sources? Or, and sometimes people, I say people, I think I should say we, I think me, all of us, we realize that maybe we're not sure, and maybe we've taken a lot of what we think we know on faith. And we have to, because we can't research everything, right? So we do have proxies, trusted proxies that we get information from. But sometimes we could be nudged to say, actually, you know what? I'm going to look into that. I'm not too sure, and I'm going to get back to you. Or, and again, so much depends on the other person or people that you're in conversation with and how they're choosing, to show up. But I don't know if I've answered your question. Is that, about expertise?
I guess it just feels like it's hard to know enough about any particular subject. So when we're, for example, like the someone behind me talked about how you can have controversial ideas within the idea of immigration, right? If you talk about it, it can seem that it's racist, but there's actual economic data. But then if you look at that data, then that can, who are you taking it from? And so it's quite complex stuff. And we're all trying to have a conversation about things that are studied from so many different angles that it can be tricky to even talk sometimes.
And I think just sometimes when we show a bit of intellectual humility, it also encourages other people to do the same. You're absolutely right. Like we don't know all the things about all the things. It's impossible. Yeah. And so putting it out there like, this is just where I'm at right now. This is what I think I know, and actually I don't know this. That can be that kind of intellectual humility. It's hard though. We get drawn into arguing so easily. Yeah.
I think we're going to have time for maybe 2 to 3 more questions at most. So just letting everyone know.
Just wanted to start this off by saying thank you for holding this and preparing everything for us to come together to do this today. A question I have is, how do we find common ground in terms of like defining what something means? Like, for example, like wokeism. Like I feel like everybody on different sides has a different definition for what this means. Like, how do we have a conversation that makes sense when we can't agree on what something means?
Yeah, I think, people will say, well, I'm not racist, I'm not homophobic, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm not anti this, I'm just against wokeism. And then you go, okay, can you tell me what you mean by that? What's your definition? And there's some really good examples in Carol Off's book of people who were put on the spot that way, and they put themselves out there as champions of anti-wokeism, and in television shows, we're asked, well, what do you mean by that, and couldn't even define it. And so I think there is a way to ask other people what they mean by that, and that isn't, again, not so challenging that they feel attacked. But sometimes what we want to do is lead people to see the areas that they are uncertain about, but make it safe to admit that.
Thank you again for this. It's been really great to have community around as well when we're talking about this. And I'm going to riff, I think, a bit on Megan's comment or her question, because I love the idea of having these one-on-one conversations, but it's just feeling like the state of the world as it is, that this needs to be accelerated so quickly. Just I'm feeling that type of like just the negative energy that's coming up through what's happened in the US and the fear that that's bleeding over into Canada and probably has already. Can you see ways of accelerating this type of coming together and dialogue, just so that we're better prepared?
$6 million question, right? Yeah. Well, not all the work has to take place at a one-to-one level. There's great work being done there, like with deep canvassing, if you have heard of that. And there are organizations, lots, surprisingly, maybe not, in the States, doing a lot of work on this. But the forums where we can do this at a larger scale are our post-secondary institutions, or we can be advocating for this type of learning in the schools, in the high schools, in the elementary schools, and there are some organizations that do that. I'm hopeful that, in fact, these external threats that we're facing right now will allow us to see just how important it is that we come together across our divides. And I don't want to dismiss those issues that we polarize around. I'm not saying they're not important, but we've got really big issues that we're facing right now, namely fascism. I'll say that, south of the border. And I think that it's calling on us all to say, who are we? And we are a whole lot more than just not American, right? As Canadians, we're a lot more than that. But we've always had trouble defining that. But now's the time, right? And I think if we start talking about that, and some of the values that are going to come up are things that ways we've historically defined ourselves, right? We are a people who value diversity. We are inclusive. We help each other. We care about the common good and the collective, not just our individual well-being. We are people who prefer negotiation to the use of force and the threats of force. And I think those are the conversations that we need to start having and that have begun. And what's implicit in that, which I really hope people can see, is, wow, we really need to get our act together. There are certain things that we need to agree to disagree on, or we need to say that exists, that disagreement exists, but we're going to rise above it. So that these big threats, they might actually, paradoxically, trigger the kind of discussion that we need to have about moving beyond polarization.
And I think we have time for
One more?
one more.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll make the question quick. I just looking around quickly, I figure that there's 66% to 30% one gender versus the other. I'm curious your thoughts on what do you think patriarchy, what role does patriarchy play in polarization?
Oh.
Whoa. Did we really have time for that last question? Wow. Okay, there's another one I haven't thought of.
Patriarchy, what role did it play in polarization?
Can I think on that and get back to you? That's a good one. Do you have an idea, Melanie?
Well, I wonder, is there something about like through the female lens to the male lens? I don't know. Is there anything in that approach to issues or these dialogues? Then we could kind of be getting into stereotypes of the way a woman communicates and a man communicates as well, though, right? So
yeah. And what is essentialism and what is learned, social conditioning, things like that. I think there are ways that we are encouraged to communicate, whether they're innate in us or not, or maybe they're innate, they're brought out. I don't know, but unfortunately, there's some very polarizing female figures, and so I wouldn't at all suggest that somehow it's all the fault of men and women are, we're immune to that. But I think that I've noticed the same thing that you've noticed, that more women tend to, show up. My research team was, for the first 3 years on the project, was there were 7 of us and 6 were women. And when we recruited for participants, the vast majority were women too. So I don't know if it's what we've been conditioned to want and to pursue. I don't want to say women are necessarily better peacemakers. I don't think that's the case either. But it might be that it's easy for us to show up in ways that are called for, for overcoming polarization. I don't know. I'm going to think on that one, though. Thank you very much.
And so, you want to do one more? Because I do want to come back to Jenny. I do have another question close. So yeah, we can go one more if you want.
Okay. I'm so sorry we can't look waiting over there.
Okay.
Hi there. Thank you so much for doing this. I know there isn't a lot of time, so I'll try and make this as quick as I can because there's a lot we've had to think about. One of the things that you mentioned in relation to trying to find common ground was this left versus right thing. One of the things that I think gets lost in this conversation is who has the power. And a lot of times it's not left, it's not right, it's people who are rich. And they can vote or push those conversations in one direction or the other, wherever the power and the money is. So can you maybe comment on why polarization is important to those that are in power, that want more power, and use state power to control the rest of us.
Yeah.
A
A certain Musk coming to mind?
Yeah. Well, money helps people get power, and money helps people keep power. And polarizing leaders who are very, very interested in power know that they capitalize on divisions that already exist there. They use grievances that people have to further divide people. And so, there is a great interest amongst polarizing leaders. So I didn't even talk about those because they'd sort of been mentioned, but I did want to mention that when I was talking about conflict entrepreneurs, that kind of the most obvious example. But some researchers say that a polarizing leader gets elected by a polarized electorate, right? So it's a bit of a self-reinforcing kind of loop there. But I think polarization it serves the interests of the powerful, and those who have the most power in the society, that's where the money tends to be concentrated. Absolutely. I don't know if that answers the question.
It's a good question. So Jennie, then thank you everybody for these, really insightful and thoughtful questions. And Jennie, thank you for everything that you've shared with us. I would like to wrap this conversation. I'd really like to leave the last word to you. What would you like people here tonight to leave with?
Yes. Well, I guess a number of things. I said earlier, you have choices, right? Don't feel like you always have to engage in a bridging conversation. Optimize the conditions, remember the tools. Don't focus your sights on the people most polar opposite to you. There's a lot more lower hanging fruit than Donald Trump, right? And it's not necessary that the poles come into agreement. The goal, remember here, is to animate all the different possible points in between and give people options that are not just the two poles. And that will bring more people into the conversation. Remember to be curious. If you're tempted to make an assertion, try to ask a question instead. Inject some uncertainty, add complexity. An author who I really like called Amanda Ripley, she was a journalist, you know her?
I don't know her personally.
Not personally. Well, she wrote a book called High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. And she wrote another piece that was amazing called Complicating the Narratives. So complicate the narratives. Don't feel like you don't have to have compassion for somebody that you really, really, really disagree with and find their views offensive. But I do think we want to insist on respecting the humanity of those people, even those with the most abhorrent viewpoints, because dehumanizing other people invites dehumanization in return, and that can only be dangerous for all of us.
And I know I said I was going to let you have the last word, but I did hear it earlier. I heard the mention of hope. And it was something that I asked you when we first started talking, because I feel sometimes overwhelmed by polarization, and sometimes you want to just hide from the world because of it, or there's a sadness that comes with it. And I just that's my final question for you, is just, do you have hope that things will be better or get better?
I have to. Yes. It's not easy to have hope. This is not a hopeful time, right? But if we look at history, we can see that collectively we have lived through some other terribly divisive, very polarized times before, and come to some sort of surprising reconciliations. Last year was 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, right? And that was the most extreme case of polarization, lethal. on a staggering scale. And yet that country has done some really impressive work on reconciliation and reunification. So I know it might seem perverse to say it could be worse, has been worse, but somehow I take a bit of comfort in that. You know, this is not the first time that we've been in a dark place. And if we got out before, or people did, then I think we can. The other thing is, we're all sick of polarization, right? And if we have nothing else in common, maybe that's our common ground. You know, it's helpful also to understand this is not happening, you know, by accident. It's largely by design. And when we know that, I think we can resist it better. Know that you're not alone if you're experiencing polarization in your family, with your friends, your social group, at your workplace, in the community at large. You're definitely not alone, you know, and it's not your fault. And, you know, there are some structural things that I've talked about that we can't change the algorithms of Facebook, but there are things that we can do. So let's exercise agency where we can. And, you know, when I was doing my dissertation, a friend gave me a card, and it was all black background with white, all caps, and it was a quote from Brene Brown, and she said, the quote was, "We can do hard things." And I put that card on the wall behind my computer, where I looked at it every single day, and it helped me so much. So I guess that's the final thought I'd like to leave you with. We can do hard things.
Thank you.
Oh, can I plug this?
Yeah. Karen, can I plug my?
Yes, plug away. There you go.
So one of the things that we produced in our research project from a couple of years ago was a resource guide with 16 of our picks from our members of our research team. You know how like you go to the paint store or the wine store or the bookstore and it's the staff picks. These were our picks of at that time anyway, our favorite books, videos, TED Talks, podcasts, whatever. And so we put them together in this color glossy report here or resource guide. And I brought a few copies of these, and I also brought some postcards that actually have a QR code that lead you to the digital version of this. And the digital version is way better, actually. I'm not just saying that. It's better because all those resources are hot linked or hyperlinked. So you can go right
and
to
it's just
them.
right outside on the table.
And
You
we've
can
got those
take it, yeah.
cards out there. And if you don't do QR codes or have a cell phone or you're not on the internet or whatever, then by all means, take one of these.
Thank
Thanks.
you. And it's also listed on your handout as well. Before we get to thanking the two of you, I have a few other thank yous and things to share. So I just want to thank Kaya, Rumer, Terry, and Roger for helping today. I want to thank the wellness and de-escalation volunteers in the room. I'm pretty happy we didn't have to use you, but it felt good to have you here, and I appreciate it. I want to thank so much North Island College for their sponsorship and assistance, with special mention of Thanu, who helped pull the logistics together just so seamlessly and with such talent and partnership. Thank you. I want to thank the CJC volunteers who assisted tonight, Katie, Chris, Gabe, and Marie, and I want to thank my coworker, Anne. Oh, it was like... And I'd like to thank Anne. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the 60+ volunteers in your community who are the heartbeat of the Community Justice Center. They are our board members. They sit on our racialized and systemically excluded advisory circle. They are restorative justice case and admin coordinators. They are facilitators and community representatives who participate in restorative justice cases. And thank you. And I will also share that they are circle keepers in training. And either later this year or early next year, we'll be launching that service to the community where we can hold dialogues in a facilitated way. Truly, restorative justice would not exist in your community without these folks. I really want to thank all of you. Your thoughtful intention, your beautiful questions are so meaningful. I think to everybody in this room, if I can say that. I think it definitely helps me leave with more hope and strength to keep doing the hard things. So thank you. And the two of you, your contribution to this evening extended far beyond the past 2 hours. You have generously shared your years of accumulated experience, your vulnerability, your care, some laughter, just such rich collaboration to bring this event to life. We also really want to acknowledge the work that you do outside of this evening to bring care and justice and connection to your communities and our communities. At this time, I'd like to invite CJC President Katie McLaurin to present you with a gift, do our raffle draw, and then close out our evening.
Thanks, Karen. On behalf of the Community Justice Center Board of Directors, I also would like to offer our thanks to the North Island College for their generous hosting of this event. I was reflecting on the college's mission of working together to build healthy and thriving communities, one student at a time. And we're very grateful for this setting, which invites us all to be students of engaging in civil dialogues during hostile times. And to you too, thank you for teaching us and igniting an important and oh so timely discussion tonight. I can only think that your perspectives will be more and more critical in the years to come and will spur ever greater commitment by our Community Justice Center to its mission of supporting peacemaking and resolution of conflict in our community. In particular, your perspectives will inform our continuing work on anti-racism and anti-hate education and response through the lens of repairing harm and restorative justice. I wanted to make particular note that your views will contribute to our leadership of the critical incident response protocol, which allows the CJC to respond in a meaningful way to incidents in our community that are driven by racism, anti-LGBTQ sentiment, or hate, resulting in distress or harm to anyone or any group of persons. In honor of this, we have a special thank you gift for you both. Karen is holding up a limited edition original critical incident poster by Andy Everson. Happens to be Kaya's uncle, I think. Yep.
Nice.
This work is called Belonging, and it shares your messages of tonight about community and inclusivity. Belonging was created to commemorate the signing of the Critical Incident Response Protocol at the Comox First Nation Big House on May 29th, 2009. It's been in place for 16 years. The print was produced using the Glycee method, and only 89 prints were created. I'd like to share Andy's words about this piece, as I believe they'll ring true with you both. Growing up in the Comox Valley, I often think of it as the most beautiful place on earth. We sometimes live a sheltered life here and focus on our immediate surroundings, the beauty of the mountains, the rivers, and the beaches. We often think of bad things taking place a half a world away. Sometimes we forget that they are also happening in our own backyard. Racial slurs, homophobic taunts, and hate-based incidents happen all the time here. Some of us are guilty of actually perpetuating this behavior, either through contributing directly to its existence or turning a blind eye when it does happen. It is time we put an end to this. It is time that we look to our neighbors and acknowledge that they belong to our community as much as we do. The Comox Valley has great diversity marked by differences in culture, religious beliefs, ethnic backgrounds, abilities, age groups, sexual orientations, and socioeconomic statuses. This diversity makes our community vibrant and alive, but can also lead to fractures between neighbors. We need to mend these divisions through understanding and acceptance, We must build a community that is strong because of our diversity and not in spite of it. In belonging, in Andy's words, I chose the rainbow to represent the diversity of the people in the Comox Valley. The 7 colors of the visible spectrum weave in and out, touching one another at numerous points. This illustrates the journey towards belonging that we as a community must face. Along the path are 3 watchmen, representing the 3 pillars of action we can use to combat discrimination: awareness, prevention, and response. Through concerted efforts to foster understanding and acceptance, we will reach a community of belonging. We have a print for both of you.
Wow. Thank you.
So Jenny, if you would be so kind to step up here, we have a raffle of 2 items. One of the items is a number of beautiful things from North Island College.
Okay. Kathleen Burkett.
Oh, sorry.
No,
It's just the one item, sorry. And inside this basket is also a Laughing Oyster Bookstore gift certificate. So the resource list that was shared with you tonight includes books related to our discussion that can be found at Laughing Oyster.
All right, we kind
Oh.
of agreed we had to be there. Go for another name.
Suspense. Roger Kishi.
Yay, Roger. Thank you, Jenny. So thank you, Jenny, and again to you, Melanie,
Thank you.
for offering us your time, your thoughts, and your important calls to action tonight. And to Karen, the managing director of the CJC, and to Anne, the office manager, for the tremendous amount of work you put into visioning this evening. And finally, in closing, I want to take a moment to thank you, our community, for joining us in this discussion. I'd like to emphasize the importance of tending to your wellness after conversations like these. They are complex and often fraught with high emotions. I encourage everyone in the room to look after themselves and each other in the coming days and months. And I thank you again for your commitment to fostering understanding in our community. Take care and have a good night.